welcome to the program. We are joined today by Phillip Ullmann. He is the founder of Covenant Advisory, an independent consultancy with a single vision to help business, institutions, and the state find and achieve their true purpose by having a positive impact on the communities that they serve. Phillip is a social business entrepreneur with a track record of building disruptive business models that deliver value measured as much by people, communities, and nature as by financial assets. Phillip believes in creating environments where talented leaders who share a passion for innovation are given the opportunity to succeed, changing their lives and the teams they allow to self-manage. This philosophy is reflected in his ability to recruit some of the most successful executives who have grown and developed the Cordant Group with revenues of over £250 million and a combined workforce of over 10,000. In 2019, Phillip and his senior team co-authored Cordant's Social Impact Report, mapping a 5-point strategy aimed at improving worker opportunities with a focus on purpose, not profits, and well-being, not just wealth. In 2020, the Cordant Group was sold to 2020 investors, and Phillip set up Covenant Advisory, the independent consultancy mandated to guide and advise businesses, their leaders, and the state on their journey to social purpose. So we wanted to find a guest who can come on and talk about a variety of economic and business topics that met the moment. And it feels like we are in a moment globally where many people are asking about their purpose and the purposes of businesses and the role that philanthropy plays, the role that the government plays, the role that businesses play. And it's easy enough to find people who will comment on this from a political angle. It's easy enough to find business people who can give you all of the academic textbook explanations of the purposes for businesses and what they contribute to society. It's easy enough to find activists who will take the other side of those arguments. It's hard to find somebody who has led a business, is an entrepreneur, has a business mindset, understands financial metrics, but also sees the challenges in the economy that we live in today, where millions of people are put to work and yet they lack purpose in their work. They don't see the benefit of what they're doing for a greater purpose or good. And business executives and leaders who are increasingly burning out because they are meeting their financial metrics and shareholder expectations, but they're meeting no greater purpose than that, leaving them to feel unfulfilled, unmotivated, and tragically, in some cases, without any purpose in life, leading them to drift and sometimes drift into depression, addiction, and other severe societal issues. So Phillip comes at this from a spiritual perspective, but also a pragmatic perspective, and it's complicated. And that's why I think he was the perfect guest for this episode. So we're going to cover a lot of ground. I ask you to strap in and put the seatbelt on because we are going to go from theory to practical implementation. We're going to talk a little bit about international finance. We're going to talk a little bit about banking. We're going to talk about philosophy. We are going to cover a fair amount of ground in the next hour or so. And so I think you're going to find this fascinating and different than most of the other conversations that we've had on this program. But Phillip's point of view is an important one, and I think important to elevate in our global awareness and to enter into this conversation. And at the end, I'll give you a couple specific thoughts that I have about this topic and that rang true to me about my conversation. But I will save that for the end, so please stay tuned for my parting thoughts on the program. But for now, I hope you'll enjoy my roughly 45-minute conversation with social entrepreneur Phillip Ullmann. Phillip, welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
So I've given a little bit of an introduction leading into this, but nobody can introduce themselves like themselves. So for the benefit of our global audience, I'd love you to give a quick introduction about yourself and your background and what brought you to your current work.
Okay, so I graduated from Cambridge with an engineering degree that was 1988, and thereafter joined a family company. So that was my natural environment. I'd studied engineering with the view to actually make real things. That's what I like doing. But I within a couple of years, it was a family company. My father and two brothers, and I changed everything within the company within a couple of years. Because what I'm able to do is to think from the ground upwards. So I asked questions that hadn't been asked, and found that there were answers that were simple that hadn't been thought about. So, for example, we halved manufacturing people. So we employed 150 people, lots of machines. We produced steel wire, which is wire that's used for springs and mattresses. And I did some work on productivity. My father, I asked my father, 1 minute, I'm looking at this productivity data. In an 8-hour shift, the worker's only busy for 2 hours. That can't be very productive. He said, oh, funny you should say that, Philip, but our competitors are operating multi-machines by one person. So I said, well, we should. And so I started to experiment with 3 operators for 4 machines and then 2 operators. So we halved productivity. We doubled productivity. We halved the amount of time required to produce material. So, and that was just one example of what I did. But from the beginning, I just asked questions which hadn't been asked, and we changed everything from top to bottom. But the bottom line, and so that's what I love doing. The trouble is that manufacturing in the UK, I saw that even then had no future. We were already talking about China, and we couldn't compete. So after transforming the company and massively increasing the profit, we had to sell it. We sold it within a couple of years, and I had to start again. So I trained as a chartered accountant. It's funny, I actually never thought about accountancy at all, because all I ever was taught about was manufacturing, which is real. But my wife said, yeah, you can make a lot of money as an accountant. So I trained as an accountant with KPMG. Hated every minute of it. It wasn't for me. Very, very non-creative. Then worked for Sainsbury's in internal audit. So, and then worked for an interesting company called Waste Creative Imaging, which was a company that was in the digital repro. So we produce quality images. For example, David Bailey would take a photograph of a model, and we'd have to retouch it. Again, they were charging, I think, £300 an hour even then. This was early on. And I said, 1 minute. And the way it worked was that there was a team that did the pricing, and they would estimate. They take a job, and they say, I think the advertising agency would pay £1,000 for this, and they would guess. And I said, 1 minute, are you sure that you're charging enough? Oh no, these people are skilled pricers. They've been doing it all their lives. I said, well, let's try and actually use a timesheet system to record. Always very simple, yeah. Record what time's been spent, and I developed it myself. I actually cut the code. I wrote the program, and we were massively undercharging. So I made a lot of money for them. The trouble is, I'm always looking after the interests of my employer, but not very good at politics. And I was working for an Anderson consultant who was good at the management consulting speak, 10 commandments, this and all kinds of stuff. And I didn't play the game. So I got sacked, despite the fact that I made lots of money for them. But it was a very important experience, because a guy called Trevor Grice, who was a kind of company doctor, called me and said, Philip, of all the people I've employed, you're unique. You need to be your own boss. You need to be at the top, because you can't work for other people. And he was right. Now, so since then, I've always had to lead the organizations that I work in, not because I'm greedy, because I just need the space. I need to create an environment where others thrive. So my father had another company which was in security. We employed about 1,000 security guards, turnover about 10 million sterling, and that was in '96. From then to 2020, I grew it to 1.2 billion, I should say, 1,200 million sterling per annum, internationally in UK, Europe, Australia, all over the world. And we moved away from security to cleaning, facility services, and recruitment. And lots of M&A. I did, I don't know, 20 or 30 acquisitions. But again, I became frustrated because we were making money, but that didn't keep me happy. I wanted to actually have an impact, and money's never done it for me. So I tried to convert the company into what was a social enterprise. Deloitte brought an opportunity to me, actually in the health service, and he said, "Would you do this as a social enterprise?" I said, "What's a social enterprise?" I had no idea what it was, and once I looked into it and studied it, I realized that's what we should be doing. We should be looking after people, looking after nature. And I tried to convert Cordant, which was big at the time, into a social enterprise. So I actually was working without any preconceived ideas. So I capped the salaries of our people so that the highest paid were paid no more than 20 times the lowest paid. I capped dividends, and I was trying to get my clients to pay a living wage for every, because these were horrible jobs. A lot of my employees were working in warehouses where they would do 18 miles in a shift, and many of them were migrants as well. So many of them would come over from Eastern Europe and would be living in shoddy accommodation, living off a packet of biscuits a day, actually sharing beds. So one person would sleep in a bed in a day. Not very nice. So I tried to convert it to social enterprise, but I couldn't do it, Brian. I wasn't able to do it. But I realized that the whole model of capitalism wasn't working. So having tried to convert it, and the point is, my clients, the big employees, the people who run big warehouses, were not interested in people. And we're not interested in nature. And therefore, I myself running even though it was a big company and employing lots of people, 100,000 people a year, I couldn't actually change the industry because my competitors were not aligned to my clients. So I learned, having tried to change the world, I realized I couldn't do it in that environment. So that takes me to 2020 when COVID hit, and we actually restructured the company, and I no longer own the company, but I was able to generate significant amounts of cash by leaving the company. And the last 4 years have been transformational. So in the last 4 years, I moved to a completely different world where I started engaging, funny enough, in the Bible. So this is something, I'm a businessman, I'm a pragmatist, but I started studying with the best people in the world. I like to call it the Book of Life because the Bible turns people off, whereas the Book of Life is more exciting. And I've worked with the best in the world. And what I'm always able to do is kind of apply the skills and take what people have done to another level. And crazy as it sounds, I've adapted to a scientific method of actually translating the Book of Life, and it's like a puzzle. And crazy as it sounds bonkers, but it's true. I'm decoding it, and I'm seeing meaning in verses that no one else has seen meaning. It's absolutely true, and so I've stumbled upon the answer to society, the answer to how we can change the world, and that's where the Manna Journey came from. The story that changes the world is the Manna Journey. It sounds esoteric, but it isn't. It's totally pragmatic. So that's what I've uncovered, and I'm trying to make it a reality now.
So there's one topic there that we use that people might be not familiar with: social enterprise, the concept of this. So help our listeners understand, as this opportunity was brought to you and as it was explained to you and as you interpreted it, what does social enterprise mean?
It means that the purpose of a business is not to make money. Its purpose is to provide the needs of people. This is my interpretation of it. It's not something that's just clearly defined, but it's a social enterprise. The purpose is for society. And that means that you're meeting the needs of society and the needs of nature. And that is your purpose. It's not that you make profit and you give philanthropy. It's not that I make £1 million and I give 10% to charity. That's not the model. The actual purpose of the enterprise is to meet the needs of people and to meet the needs of nature. It's a completely different paradigm. It's a paradigmic shift.
So obviously you attempted this in that company, ran into some challenges because you doing it alone put you at a competitive disadvantage, right?
Yes,
So
absolutely.
there's a lot of people out there who would listen to that and think, well, that is an admirable goal, but there's a large portion of the economy, the global economy, that says, nope, the purpose of a business is to go make money for its shareholders or its owners. So in order for this to work, is it where do you begin? Because I think you did try as a single player in this space, and I'm sure there were some who wanted to come along with you on this, but the system as a whole was just against you from day one.
Spot on. Very perceptive, right? Exactly that. You can't do it yourself because um, business, as we understand it, is looking after the shareholder. In the UK, there's a piece of legislation called the Companies Act 2006, and there's a section 172 where and I'm sure it's the same in America. The purpose of the vehicles of a business is to look after the interests of the members, namely the shareholders, and that's deeply ingrained. It's intrinsic, as you say, to business, and that's what directors have to do. That's their fiduciary duty. And the state is supposed to look after people and look after nature and act as a countervailing force. But the trouble with that is the two are competing with each other. They're not actually aligned. And that's why I couldn't do it when I was at Cordant, which was the company that we built, because my competitors were not aligned, as you've said. The state wasn't aligned. So what I realized is we have to actually carefully analyze the paradigm that we're currently in and look at a new paradigm. And I think we all sense, Brian, that the system is failing. I mean, look around. I see what just happened in America in the election, that neither the Republicans or the Democrats are listening to people. People are struggling. People are struggling with the cost of living increase. They can't put food on the table. They're struggling. Young people are struggling to buy homes. Jobs are, I don't know if you've read David Graeber, but he talks about jobs which he calls them BS jobs, that meaningless jobs. That the vast majority of people have jobs that they don't actually enjoy. And so there's a fundamental issue, I call it the elephant in the room, which nobody's dealing with, which is listening to people. And the same is true in the UK. I'm not criticizing particular people because they're part of a system, but Republicans, Democrats, Conservatives, Labour, even the Reform and the Lib Dems, they're all from the business shareholder paradigm. Nobody is actually looking after people, looking after nature. So that's the point I reached. And that's where the managed journey comes in. So essentially, to summarize here, there's two paradigms as I see it. There's the command and control paradigm, which is decisions are made by people with power. It could be the directors of a company. It could be the state. And they make those choices at a high level. And the typical person doing a job is a slave. They are actually not making choices. It's very clear to me. If you're not making decisions every day, and decisions are being made further up the hierarchy, you're effectively dead. I'll be straight. You actually are not living. It's as profound as that, because we need to make decisions. We need to care for our wives, our families, our communities, and our society, our nation. And if you are simply being told what to do by your employer, who's in the boardroom and he's getting papers being presented to him by employees and he's making the choices, or the state, which is making ridiculously complex legislation that no one understands, or even you're listening to social media and you're subliminally being programmed into thinking in a certain way. You're listening to an echo chamber and you're not being encouraged to think, you're a slave. And that's the world of command and control. And that's what the manna journey, that's a story it tells. The manna fell every day for 40 years. And the key is the daily decision making. We have to create a world where we make choices every single day. And those choices are related to our family, our community, and our nation. And those choices are about providing food for one loved ones. It's about clothing, accommodation, but they've got to be made by you. So we have to recreate the world with choices coming back to be. We have to bring them back to life, because at the moment we're living with lots and lots of people who are not living. So the manna tells a story of how it fed every day, and they only got the right amount of food for the day. Now, how do I translate that into the monetary economy? The key is daily decision making. So I don't know if you're familiar with economics theory of money. They say there's three different functions of money. One, it's a unit of accounts. Two, it's a store of value. And three, it's a means of exchange. I want to take you through those separately because they're very profound and deep, because none of those are true. Now, the first, because what the manna journey tells you is that it was actually daily decision making. Yeah, every day they made a fresh decision, which means they didn't take into account the history. They couldn't store or hoard it overnight, and there was no exchange. Now, let me give a practical example of what I mean by money, which is not a unit of exchange. What a unit of exchange means is history. That when you're valuing a house, Brian, you value, let's say it took 10 people a year to build a house. Let's say a person costs, I don't know, $50,000 a year. That's $500,000 or to build a house. And what we then do is we impose that on a single person. It's history, right? It's finished, it's done. But we don't think about it. So we take it as a unit account. If we say, okay, you are going to have to take out a mortgage for $500K in order to get a house, which means you're a slave straight away, because that was a societal obligation to build a house, and society's built it, and the house is there. So what I realized is unit of account leads to debt. History means it leads to debt, and that leads to slavery. So what the Book of Life is saying is don't use the unit of account. That's not the function of money, because that builds debt, and they will become slaves to banks that produce money. We can talk about that in a minute as well. The second traditional economic answer is a store of value. Now, if we see money as a store of value, it means that we're hoarding, which means there's money in the bank account, which I can use to pay higher prices than others. And that causes inflation. And inflation is theft from the poor, because theft, when prices increase, or even the price of a house grows, we see that as an investment return. It's actually inflation. It means that poor people can't buy houses. So a store of value is also not what money is about. So it's neither a unit of account nor a store of value. The third economic answer is a means of exchange. But that assumes you always want more. If I've got what I need, why do I need something back in exchange? Because if I provide you with your needs and I've got everything that I need, why do I want more back? So all of those three are not the right answer. What the manna journey tells you is it's a daily decision that you have to make. So you have to have the right amount of money, literally, to provide you with 1 day's, the manna fell for 1 day. So let's assume $50 for one of a just a practical example, and the population of a country is 1 million. So literally what the manna journey is saying is $50 million is all the amount of money you need, which is the amount that every million people need for a day. And what we need to do is get that to flow around the system. And therefore, when I spend the money, provide my own needs, the needs of my family, the needs of my community. But I want to make sure that it flows. I need to make sure that it goes to everybody, that everybody gets their $50 for tomorrow. And therefore, what we're trying to achieve is a flow. Flow is a powerful word. You know, when this conversation, I think, is flow, even though I'm talking too much. So what happens is at the end of that day, if let's say a million people all have $50, at the end of the day, you'll find some people have got $100 and some people have got $0 at the end of the day because it won't flow perfectly. The next lesson of the managed journey is on the Friday, they had double. They had $100. And that's to teach you if you, and by the way, they didn't collect double because they were only supposed to collect 50. It happened to reach their account. And that's what it's saying. If you have $100 in your bank account, which you may call an excess profit, you have to, what it means is money suddenly has a meaning. $50 is what one person needs for a day. There's somebody out there that hasn't got the $50 they need. But of course, so you have to have people that provide the $50 to the people that haven't got, because of course they need their food and clothing. So you create an extra $50 for the people that haven't got a job. But that means there's an extra $50 in someone's bank account. And what the system beautifully says is that person has to find a home for the $50. So they have to go out, and this is a very distributed system, Brian. I realize the community and locality is massive in the Mali. It's all about the place. So you have to go out. If you've got an extra $50, it's not profit for me to be able to buy a yacht or to buy stuff I don't need. It's to go out into the local streets and find out people who are not meaningfully employed and the jobs that are not being done, and to match the two. So money suddenly has a meaning in life. It's not a unit of account, a store of value, or a means of exchange. It's actually to ensure that people's needs are met every single day. So when I have extra money, I look at how many $50, and I've got to use that to find somebody who is unemployed and to re-inject it back into the flow. So you never have more than $50 million. So what that means is no inflation. Once and for all, we get rid of inflation. And that is the bane of our lives.
So I think you've explained pretty well the journey and a different paradigm through which we could look at the economy of the world, the economy of any country. As you think about the last 50 years or so, I feel, and I think a lot of our audience feel, that the opposite point of view, the original thought of money as you defined it, has been defined in general economics, has become more ingrained. And so it's actually become harder to get to this place. Now, I'm curious from your perspective as somebody who has run businesses, has interacted with business leaders, has been part of large organizations. Is it just our perception, or do you feel like society actually, and maybe at the business community level, has actually become more cynical and more oriented towards the old definitions of success and profit? And it's actually exacerbating the underlying problems that you've identified here, because it certainly seems like there's been decades of just cynical profit at all costs without consideration to people, society, the planet. That's what I think people feel, which is why your message is welcome, I think, by many. But there's probably a portion of our audience that feels like they just have not seen this in action anywhere in their lifetime.
You're absolutely right. And it's interestingly, it started 50 years ago. I don't know if you know, the Jubilee is 50 years. So it's pointing at, and what happened was Nixon broke the link between the dollar and the gold standard. So whilst what I'm talking about is a people standard where the money is linked to the number of people, a gold standard, even though they weren't playing by the rules and there was far more dollars than there was money in the stores of gold. Once that link was broken, the shackles were off, and whether it was Reagan or Thatcher, since then, money has completely been unleashed. You think about it, this was in my life. I've seen it happen, and money has become. That's what you're sensing. It's become meaningless, and therefore things like casino banking, derivatives, all this nonsense, which is creating huge amounts. I mean, no one even knows. They've stopped measuring the money. There's so much of it. Now, this is trillions, gazillions of money, which is futile and meaningless. And therefore, what started to happen is money lost its purpose. And I think after the Second World War, there was a feeling of having to rebuild family and community. In the UK, the National Health Service the benefit system started because they wanted to care for each other, but that only lasted for about 20 years. And then the 70s, you get the move back from the we to the I. And that's what we've lived with for the last 50 years, since Reagan and Thatcher and all the various presidents and prime ministers in between. They all are following the same paradigm, and they're making more and more money. And it's selfish. I'll be straight with you. It's all about me. And I'll be honest with you, it doesn't lead to meaningful life. Having more money in your bank account is meaningless. So what's happened is the profit motive has proliferated. Um, what we had before were people who were responsible business people. Yeah, they may have run, they ran businesses and looked after their staff. And at my father's factory, they loved their people. I remember a story when the Christmas fund was run by one of the fitters, and he actually stole the money. And my father felt so bad for his workers. He actually repaid all the money to keep. They were family. It was a different relationship. So there was much more relationship within the workplace, and that was unfortunately crushed by when the unions were crushed in Thatcher's times and then Reagan's time. They just lost these relationships, which is so important. So we've had 50 years completely right, where relationships have been damaged, people have focused more and more money, and because the link with the gold standard was broken, there was no constraint. So what's important to understand, Brian, is how money is created. And money is literally created by the banks. Okay, not the central banks, the actual commercial banks. 97% of money is actually literally lent into existence. They don't need deposits. They literally create the money, and that people don't understand, because these are private organizations that literally are allowed to create as much money as they want. And of course, they use that money to lend as security as they can. And therefore, if they lend on an asset, which is whether it's a debt with debt financing or real estate, commercial, residential real estate, they have security. So they lend more and more money on these assets, and that pumps up the asset prices. So what we've seen, and it pumps up, by the way, business prices. If you look at a VC world, the private equity world, that's what they do. All they do is gearing. Their game is uplifting the price of a business by putting debt in, and that simply increases the price. So what we've done is we've pumped up asset prices, whether that be real estate, commercial and residential, or the shares and stocks and shares. They have all of those have been inflated in prices, and that means that money is being used to actually inflate assets, to inflate shares, and or to inflate consumer prices. And that's actually theft from everyone else, because people who haven't got assets, who haven't got property, who haven't got shares, are being stolen from. And that's where we've got to now. That's why there's so much disillusionment with the system. That's why we had social unrest in the UK. You know, these riots are not criminals. There are obviously, there's an element of people who exploit it, but it's because people are not being listened to, and the system is failing. And that's why people are sensing there's a need for a reset, and 50 years is a jubilee. So we need to start to think about a new vision, which is the managed journey, which I'm happy to explain more about. But it's necessary because the paradigm is not looking after people. People are not being cared for, nor is nature. The answer is not net zero, by the way, which is effectively business using it for its own end. The answer is to go back to understand the land, understand agriculture, to start to regenerative farming, stop using insecticides, stop tilling the ground, stop there's lots of techniques which actually start to combine nature, allow the animals to graze on the soil. There are things like that which are real, which change the way we operate, rather than net zero, which is an artificial target that no one understands. But you're right. Yeah.
So anytime there's a social change, and let's call it consciousness, and you begin to see changes like what you're talking about, there's some sort of a tipping point. There's a key business, a key public figure, a key change in government that begins to change the entire incentive structure. with everything that you've described, where do you think that change in mindset has to come? Because as I talk to a lot of people who are in business leadership positions, I don't think they would fundamentally disagree with what you're saying, but they would argue that they're just as trapped as everybody else, because if they don't meet the numbers and they don't get the shareholder figures right, they're going to be replaced by somebody who can. And you talk to some people who are investors, and if they're not a big enough investor, they don't have a big enough voice. Their vote doesn't count as much as an institutional investor to force any of these changes in companies. So, where do you think the change has to come from to reach that tipping point where more businesses and more leaders and more investors start to look at the incentive structure the way that you're articulating it, as opposed to the way it has been now for decades?
A super question. That's the key question. The answer is the system will collapse. It has to collapse. These kind of, I mean, in the Book of Life, they left Egypt. They were slaved, and they had to come out of that environment and start again. They left Egypt. They crossed the Dead Sea, the Reed Sea. The next day, the manna started. So you have to have a complete systemic collapse, a reset. I found this in my business life. We employed lots of carers, and they would do a sleeping night. So they would work during the day for 12 hours, and they'd often spend the night with their patient for another 12 hours. The question was, do you pay the minimum wage when they're asleep? And it's funny, I actually went to Hansard, which is a record of the parliamentary debate, and the legislation actually, they discussed it, and they said, because the person's sleeping, we don't want to pay otherwise you're paying 24 hours a day. So they actually discussed it and said, no, don't pay a sleeping night. Now, what happened is this came to the court, to the High Court, in the Court of Appeal, actually, and a top judge who then became Supreme Court chairman was on the panel. And he said, when he didn't look at Hansard, he didn't look at the law and Parliament. He actually did what we call judicial legislation. He said, look, the guys can't leave the site, and therefore he's slaved. So he chose to start again. And he said, no, we should pay when he's sleeping. So this is completely, you've got a fork in the law. I was told this by a guy called Chris Jeans, who's a top barrister, who explained it to me. And so you get a fork in the law where new law is made, and it's nothing to do with the original law. It's a fork. And then you've got hundreds of cases that were built on this fork because the law didn't want to pay when they were sleeping. So, of course, once the fork has happened, they've got to make it up. And all subsequent case law was made up. And that's the point that we have to recognize. We've had lots of forks in the way. And we made money, banking, derivatives, law, accountancy, these general things, these meaningless jobs, there are loads of them. I'm not trying to scare people because I think most people would recognize I am an accountant, so I know, and my wife's a lawyer, and these become futile jobs. They pay the mortgage and they put food on the table, but very few people derive true meaning from these jobs. So there's so many different forks that we've made, and we built the system on a load of forks, and then what you need to do is come out of Egypt and start again. So to my mind, there will be a systemic collapse when I don't know, but I don't think it's long away. But I can't tell you precisely when. But it happened in 2008, and this time I think is much bigger. I think the amount of debt that is being created in America is something like $1 trillion every 6 months. It's going to go wrong because eventually the markets are going to say, 1 minute, they're creating more and more debt. Are they ever going to be able to repay it? Therefore, I want. And what's inflation? Inflation, they say, is 2 or 3. But is it actually 2%? It's actually nearer 10%, as many of us know. And therefore, eventually, they start to charge a higher interest rate. And to me, a systemic collapse, it could happen in many ways, but I think there will be a systemic collapse, and I think the dollar will be at the heart of it. And then I think once a dollar goes, I think all the fiat currencies will collapse. To me, and that is positive because it means the system needs it. And then when that happens, the key is not to go back to what we did last time, which is in the UK, and the bankers get into a room with the politicians and they bailed out the bankers. That can't happen again this time. And the key is I'm trying to educate people into that there is an alternative. It's the manna journey. We don't need to be slaves. It's not, by the way, just a jubilee. The debt forgiveness is part of it, but we have to create a system based on the manager journey with daily decision making. We have to revisit the way that the jobs that we want. We want meaningful jobs now. Okay, we want jobs where I'm looking after my neighbours. A good example of a meaningful job and this transition is brought by a guy called Frederick Laloux, who wrote a book called Reinventing Organisations. I'm not sure if you heard of it. Reinventing, phenomenal book. It's worth the read. Your viewers will love it. Absolutely game changing, changed my life. And he talks about consciousness. He wanted to see businesses that were operating at another level of consciousness. So he went around the world, and I think he found something like 10 to 15 businesses that he felt were operating from a new level of consciousness. And the one that was the best example was Buurtzorg, which was a district nursing company in Holland. A fascinating story where all the district nurses eventually were employed by 2 or 3 large organizations, and they dehumanized the work. So what happened is the nurses specialized. One nurse would bathe the patients, another would change dressings, another would take blood. So eventually you become a cog in a machine. So you only do one task, because the division of labor, and then you're told where to go. So you have a program that tells you you've got to go to this patient. You've got 3 minutes to do your job, and off to the next one. And that destroyed the lives of the nurses and the patients. The nurses hated it because they felt like cogs in a machine. They're dead. Again, as I've said to you in the beginning, it's not hard. If you're not making real choices which care for others, and you just become a thing, and therefore these nurses became things, and so did the patients. The patients were having to explain their case history 15 times. Where previously they had one nurse, they had eventually 15 nurses, and there was no relationship. So a guy called Joost de Blok, actually a Christian, actually he said, 1 minute, this is crazy. The nurses hate it and the patients hate it. We have to go back to create meaningful jobs. So he took a group of 10 nurses and said each nurse is going to take responsibility. I think it was something like 5,000 patients, and start to build relationships and start to reintegrate into really meaningful jobs which care about patients. So the first thing a nurse would do would be sit down with a patient and ask him or her about their needs, about their conditions, and they would then really build a relationship and meet all of their needs to start with. But then what they realize, of course, is sometimes there were tasks that need to be done when the nurse is elsewhere. So they start to say, 1 minute, have you got family? Have you got children? Have you got who would actually help you? So they started to rebuild a family, and families started to help with distant damaged relationships were rebuilt. So you start to rebuild the family. And then they said, 1 minute, if there's no family, what about neighbors? So they knocked on the neighbors' doors, and believe it or not, neighbors are happy to meet the needs of other neighbors in need. So the whole paradigm changed. It became all about purpose. They created self-management teams of 10 people with decision-making called by what they call the advice process, which I can explain if you want. But they started to create meaningful jobs and meaningful relationships. And fortunately, this actually took in Holland, and this was 2006. By 2016, they started off with 10 people, and then he started the nurses started to love it because they were coming back to life. They were making choices again. The patients loved it, and it was cheaper. It was actually cheaper as well, so it was much cheaper. And then he also had an interesting relationship with his competitors because he saw his purpose as caring for the patients. He would educate his competitors because he wasn't trying to compete with them. He was teaching them how to do it. So that was 2006. By 2016, the whole literally of district nursing in Holland has moved to the Buurtzorg model. And so it's an example where you have a paradigmic change, where you start to give people choices. You're starting to build relationships, rebuilding family, community, nation, and it changes the lives of people.
Yeah, I mean, one principle in business is that there's a lot of copycats. And so if you can prove the model in one environment, you will win over a lot of others simply out of a fear of missing out. That somebody has done something right and they now have a competitive advantage against you. So if a business leader or a government leader came to you and they said, we'd love for you to consult us on this journey, and we'd love for you to help us understand how we can apply this. Talk a little bit about how you approach whether it's a business, a government, a
Okay,
nonprofit agency for that matter.
it's
Give our listeners a sense of how
you,
you approach the
you've
challenge.
asked the question at the right time. I dabbled with politics recently. I was working with a leading politician, um, and it didn't work. The politics is broken as well. The system. I'm not blaming that. There was a lovely, again, he's a Christian, lovely guy, but the system is broken. The whole way leaders are selected doesn't work, and so I've recognised that I want to be an outsider. You know, I'm always been an outsider all my life. I've never been in the establishment, and I have to remain that way. That's why I've been able to challenge the system, because during the course of my life, people have tried to crush me. And fortunately, I've been blessed. I've always been able to withstand the crushing. But that means that I'm not scared to ask any questions. So what I've realized is I've got to tell the story. It is a story, right? It's people love stories. And the Manna Journey website, MANNA, is where that story is told. And I want people who listen, who want to change the world, to start to engage in the material, to start thinking about what we need to do. Because the change, Brian, is going to be led by the people. It's not going to be led by the leaders, because that system is broken. So what we need to do is educate. The kind of podcast that you're doing, we need to re-educate people so they realize there is another way. And the change will come from people like you, with podcasts like this, where they recognize there is a paradigm. There's another paradigm, which is about the Manna Journey. It's about building relationships, about caring for others. It's about daily decision making. It's about a new form of money, a new form of business. And then once enough people follow you, follow me, and start to come onto the websites, then it will gain momentum. And then the leaders will follow. They will see that the people will start to say, 1 minute, when the system collapses, don't do what happened last time. We're not going to allow it. We want to go back to a new model. We want to start again. And that would happen from the people.
One last note on, you mentioned banking earlier. And I think this is one thread that ties most of the world together, whether people understand it or not, is the way that money and debt is created and distributed is pretty much the same model everywhere, no matter what government you live under or what form of government you live under. Can you give us a sense from your perspective about where we are in that journey? Because you hear all the time from people who say, well, we're on the cusp of another banking crisis, another financial crisis, which is probably true, but we've been through many and we just kind of continue to repeat the same mistakes. But it does feel like at a certain point, there will be the big one, if you will.
You're right.
And it will truly be global, and there'll be nowhere in the world that's safe from it. You alluded to it a little bit earlier. You felt like the United States is a bit of the epicenter of it. So maybe just flesh that out a little bit.
So let me explain to you very simply. We need to remember money is lent into existence. It's created by the banks. Crazy systems. So they're private organizations. They create more and more money. And then they force you to pay interest on money they've created. That's balmy. They didn't make it. They just literally create it. They charge you for the privilege. And what's more than that, if you don't pay the interest, they take your asset, they take your house. It's fundamentally a flawed model, and it will never work. So we have to recognize that the banking system is not fit for purpose. I'm not attacking bankers. As you say, people like Zuckerberg, they're all people that mean well, but they're caught in a system. The bankers are caught, the traders are caught, and therefore it will never work, because the model fundamentally is not going to work. So we need to re-look at money. Money should be about meeting the needs of people every single day. That means it's not credit in this world. It's about meeting people's needs every single day. So if I've got £50 in my bank account, I don't hoard it. I've got to find an extra £50. I've got to find somebody who needs a job. And we need to start to recreate a flow of money, which means that banking will go. Banking will go. There will still be a need for bank accounts. This is not a CBDC. That's the opposite of what we need. We don't need more central control. We need distributed responsibility, where people locally work together to ensure that everyone's needs are met, the families, the communities are rebuilt, and that the money flows around the system and money becomes meaningful. So, and that means that when a systemic collapse happens, people like you and me are educating others. So they start to recognize that we have to get banking right. And the money is not about credit. It's not credit. It's actually to meet people's needs every single day. So no credit, no interest, no repayment even. But it's about meeting people's needs every single day, because what we really need are relationships. Once people recognize that and start to think about what that means, meaningful jobs, meaningful families, etc., we'll be able to reset society and start to build from the bottom upwards based on the managed journey.
We do have a fair number of business leaders and entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs who listen to this program. If you had a word of advice for them as they're thinking about how to set their businesses up and as they embrace some of the message that you've had here today, it's almost a question of what would you tell yourself if you met yourself 30 years ago? There are people listening to this show who are in the shoes that you were in the past. What advice would you give them as they begin on their entrepreneurial and their business leadership journey?
So focus on purpose. Don't focus on money because it won't make you happy. Focus on relationships, on purpose, on really meeting the needs of humans, of people, of family. So the target you should have is, if you're very skilled and talented, not that I want to have $1 billion in my bank account, but I want to help 1 million people find meaningful work, build families with beautiful wives, lovely children, and to do something that cares, looks after the nature, looks after the planet. And if you focus, you do need to make profit. I'm not talking about loss making, but profit is almost not what you're focused on. In the managed journey, it was inadvertent. They didn't collect the extra 50. It happened to get there. So when you get it, see it as a responsibility to look after others that haven't got. Look after, but it doesn't mean that this is not charity. You're not giving it away. You actually are helping to build healthy relationships. Focus on those relationships, on looking after nature, and you'll have a meaningful and exciting life.
Let's give people that website one more time if they missed it.
It's The Managed Journey, THMANNA Journey, JOURNEY.com.
And we'll include a link to that in the description of this podcast. Phillip, thank you so much for taking time to walk us through this today.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for your time.
One of the reasons that I felt it was important to do this interview with Phillip and to dive into some of the topics that we talked about today was to keep with our theme of keeping you ahead of the news and ahead of the headlines and giving you a peek around the corner into conversations of the future. It is my belief that our society, our global society, not just the Western society, not just the English-speaking society, but our entire global human race is going to have deeper conversations around the purpose for the business community in our nations and our societies in the coming weeks, the coming months, the coming years in all likelihood. Now, the reason I think this is coming is because there are advances in technology that are going to increasingly allow businesses to make exponentially more money with exponentially fewer people, to the degree that some point down the road, many businesses that are very profitable and very successful will be able to do so with little to no human workers. And some businesses that will be able to grow without having the normal constraints of public policy that might have prevented them from polluting their environment or from abusing their workforce. Because businesses are growing more and more powerful to the degree that they're more powerful than the governments in the countries that they operate in. There are businesses, especially in the technology space, that have leverage over governments, will be too big to regulate. And so these companies will occupy a new space in our human existence. They will become governors of their own. Some already have. Some would argue that some technology companies are so critical to the functioning of governments, militaries, economies, that they have an outsized influence in what happens in our lives, whether it's the public square of conversation or whether it's the manufacturing of critical goods and services or food or the administration of healthcare. The point is, there's always been a little bit of a tension in the heart of any country about the role of the business community and its responsibilities and obligations. But generally, those have been conversations on the sidelines. I think those are going to come to the forefront. I think these existential questions of what is the purpose of a business are going to become matters of public debate, public policy, and potentially decisions that even investors may have to weigh in on with their dollars and with their commitments and their investments of large public funds. So what I want to leave all of you with today is a sneak preview. The conversation that I had with Phillip here today is basic, and there's a lot more that we could have and can dive into. I hope you got a lot out of it. I let Phillip do a lot of talking because I thought he had a lot to share, and I guided the conversation in a way that I hope was helpful for us to kick that off together, you and I. But I just want you to know this is the beginning of a larger social conversation that's likely to take place over a long period of time about the role of a business, its purpose, and the role that we all play as part of those businesses. Now, I simply ask you before that conversation really begins in earnest, and we all have to figure out what side of the issue that we are on, whether you are leading a business today, aspire to lead one in the future, or simply work for a company today, I would ask you to take the question in a slightly different way, and that is, for you personally, to answer this question. What is the purpose of your work? The way that you earn a living in the world today? What is your purpose for working? And I have always argued that whether it's a business or an individual, the reason that businesses exist and the reason individuals work hard is to help others. At the end of the day, every business is simply trying to figure out who its customer is and what their problems are that business and its team of people can solve. And that most people who go to work every day are going to work to solve a problem for someone else. People who work in healthcare want to solve the problem of people who are sick. People who work in construction want to solve the problem of people who need homes and offices. People who go into law enforcement are solving the problem of safety. You can go on and on the list of every trade in the country. You can go on the list of every white-collar job in the country. You're always there to help someone. And if you look at it in that very optimistic point of view, then the purpose of your work and the purpose of your company and the purpose of a business is to help others. And the more people you help, the wealthier you get, and the wealthier that the businesses become, and the better society is. That's the hope. That is the most optimistic view. But that assumes that everybody in that system is truly thinking about their contributions in the context of who they're helping. It's important that thus those of us who are part of the economy, though, take the time to really consider whether we are lending our skills and talents in a way that truly helps others, and if we're doing that for a company that's committed to helping. Because I would argue that there are some companies that have stopped focusing on helping others and simply focused on how they can do the bare minimum to help whoever is in critical need that is willing to give them some money to keep them alive. But the rest of their work is all financial engineering, figuring out how to grow and how to have a profit, but without really doing anything to help anybody any better than they have in the past. In other words, they don't want to compete. They simply want to find the easy way. Lay people off, have an inferior product that's marketed in a better way, undercut competition through regulatory shenanigans, use legal maneuvers to keep their competition at bay so that they don't have to be forced to improve. These are all real things. And what's coming around the corner is automation that will make human employees less and less important and will allow businesses to earn more and more money while serving fewer and fewer in their community, specifically through employment. There may come a day where large companies are no longer net job creators. They become so efficient that they don't really need people at all. And then it follows to the small businesses. But those small businesses may not be able to compete against their larger competitors who become more efficient, earn more money, and are able to tie up governing and regulatory systems to their benefit at the detriment of the larger society. Everything I'm talking about here is at the heart of many political conversations and economic conversations. But I simply ask you, as the average ordinary listener, before this conversation comes to all of us in the world, before it does become something that people vote on, before it becomes something that regulators weigh in on, just know where you are on this issue. Just think about what your purpose for your work is and for the companies that you work for. Because that's the beginning of the larger dialogue, of the larger conversation about what is the purpose of a company, what is the purpose of a business, what is your purpose. And if you have that answer, and if you know that, and if you know who you're trying to help, then you'll be able to have a much more informed opinion as the international community grapples with what is likely to be one of the topics of the next decade. The purpose of business, the purpose of work, and if it's time for us to rethink all of the above. Thank you all again for listening to this program. I hope we've given you something to think about in this fascinating episode. If you'd like to subscribe to my program, please do so on any of your favorite podcast platforms: Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, to name a few. Of course, you can find me on YouTube as well at Brian J. Matos Podcast, where you can leave comments and also find clips of these shows. You can also find me on any of your favorite social media platforms and my website, brianjmatos.com. Thank you so much for listening. Hope we've given you some good things to think about today. And until next time, this is Brian J. Matos, encouraging you all and inviting you all to stay curious.